So then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation is from the original documents of the Hebrews of old, from the time of the prophets of Israel, giving us then bearings for Gentiles and save the Hebrews. So then no nation or kingdom or prince would be able to make sure then these scriptures then would be prevented from people then to understanding them and then also to obeying them. As we understand, so many areas of our globe is experiencing lots of wars and unrests, then we can begin to understand the areas of the last government of the end, secularly speaking, and making a reference of China being the leader of the end of time trade. The reason why, it's because first indicator was Shaliach Shaul, then when he was teaching and then relinking the Gentiles and giving then his people directives as far as dispensation of Ruach HaKodesh, he was simply then speaking of the completion of the spring feast as per the times and seasons very known to his people during his time. So he was simply then praying with them, and then Ruach HaKodesh would come, and then the people would cluster. Because then the functions were being distributed and they had to function themselves as unison, so then they would do what the Messiah told them to do, go around the world and form holy tabernacles. So then the Gentiles would be then given directives. When they would sense they would have to have directives, they would simply report to the holy cities. So this is what is returning, because it's very exciting, it's very refreshing understanding this point, because their nations are no longer required of them measuring themselves up with the scripture. They simply resume what they were given to resume, mostly trade around the world. This is what's coming. And then understanding this very factor, where then Shaliach Shaul was teaching the people mostly around the Asian countries, to then at the end of times we understand why. Because they were the first people and nations around where then Shaliach Shaul began to explain the dispensation. You know, the kingdom to come government, how they should do trade amongst themselves. That's why then at the end of time, it is closing then with the very first people receiving the first instructions from Shaliach Shaul. So that's why then when we read Revelation, the 8th chapter, the third part of the ships then gives you the clue that China is going to be then the leader of the end of time trade. Mostly because of where it started, then it finishes. They retained the teachings of Shaliach Shaul regarding the trades of their countries very, very strongly. They didn't believe the Messiah most of the time, but then when they had questions regarding the problems in their governments, they began to write it down. And then as they were facing those troubles, they began to put in practice the kingdom to come government ways of trading. That's why they are so prosperous. But since we know then the time of the end regarding China, then we are aware of what not to do. Because we have reached a portion of the prophetic from the original documents of the Hebrews. It's very important. This explanation of these prophecies are from the original Hebrews. From the very Creator that came down, on the top of the tabernacle in the desert, a fire from heaven. That's where those manuscripts has a tracing from. So we are not making a reference of the renewed covenant from Greco-Roman junk. We are making the precise understanding of those prophecies from the time of the Hebrews. So then we understand that Yohanan, he was in the mainland, and he was in the first holy city of his time. The reason why we know? Because visions are only given from heaven when there is the holy city. The distinction from visions and then dreams. So then Daniel had dreams, not visions. understanding from the fact after then the facts were taking place, then when they returned to the land, they had to come up with the records of what was done previously. So the nation then returned to Israel after the 70 years of captivity, because the nation of Israel did not maintain the yearly Shabbat. So in 490 years of owning the land, the rest year of Shabbat was never kept. And then reached the 70th, and then they had to leave the land because the land had to rest. So then we don't take any understanding from any other culture of the world but then the Torah itself. That's where we find a certain amount of years then they should have the land rest, and they never did it. That's why the nation went to captivity. So then when they returned to the land, they had to come up with the records and maintain the covenant with Abraham. Then they had to redo the entire writing of those scriptures. Because when the nation was taken captive, then tabernacle burned, houses burned, people taken captive, priests slain. It was a disaster, and then they lost the records. So when they returned, they had to rewrite those records. And sometimes, after the fact, rather than understanding, then the prophet Daniel had dreams, because his custom was to go near the river, and there he would take a nap because of the long walk. During the time he was taking a nap, then the dreams would come. And in the dreams, he would have as then future videos of the situation. And in those videos, then would come explanations. And then later, he would wake up. He would return, and he would maintain those secrecies to himself. Because those were secrets, they had to be guarded very closely. So then, however, when Yohanan was in the holy city, he was then making an example of the subsequent cities that would have to come later. Yohanan's model of a city was from the city of the desert, not Jerusalem of the time, because Jerusalem at the time rejected the Messiah, but then the prophecies went on. The prophecies had maintained truth themselves, and then Yohanan, he knew it. So then he modeled his city based upon the desert's city. And then the Torah, as we know today, this big, huge animal skin with many characters on it, mostly Aramaic, those were taken apart. It's not a big, huge Torah. They are tiny Megillas, or writings in sections from times and seasons, because the author is not important in Hebraic understanding. The most important is being linked with the Spirit, and those done by then times and seasons, times and seasons, times and seasons. With those then comes the prophecies. That's why then when you read, for instance, Shaliach Shaul speaking then in the 5th chapter of Thessalonians, you find then himself speaking, but regarding then times and the seasons, he would not have to write to them, because he would, knowing that these people were very acquainted with times and seasons. But after many centuries, we in this Gentile modern world, we don't have sometimes the understanding of the times and seasons, but we know those work. So then he began to understand what goes on then at the time of the end, when this secular government of China is going to take over the leadership of the entire global market. It is a time and season depicted, and then in a couple of places. Heavenly's understanding of rebuilding comes from Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, the city and the cities. Then later you find in Daniel 12th chapter, then sections of the secular time. So the secular time indicates then nations would be as iron and clay, some of them strong as iron, some of them weak as mud. Then we make a reference then to Yeshayahu. And then he make a reference to Leviticus, then points back to the instructions. And when this line of understanding then points to the instructions, then we are in safe ground. Because then we understand why then the Chinese are going to be leading then the end of the world's market. Because we have to take an understanding, for instance, Daniel, the 12th chapter, Zechariah, the 12th chapter, then we find Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, and then those are traceable in distinct layers, times and seasons. So the understanding first then comes from the Messiah himself. While he was completing the spring feast, he spent a couple days with the Samaritans, each day 1,000 years each. He was indicating the Gentiles would have the rulership of the world's trade for 2,000 years. So then, when you trace the line from world's rulership of the Gentile rulership, Gentiles, not divine, then you have to start with the Messiah, gave them 2 days, couple thousand years, and then through history you find these secular kingdoms taking charge of the world's market. So then at the time of the end, because of the records we have from the prophecies of Daniel, who was then the most important king ruling the entire world? Babylon. During the time of Joseph was Pharaoh. And then later became then Rome, and then later became another country. So each of those, they are the leaders when heaven then becomes in charge. We are then transitioning at time from the 1,000 years of deceit back into the truth. As heaven then intervenes with this time of a great high knowledge, has to have a country in charge of the rulership of trade, because then goes in line with the 2 days the Messiah spent with Samaritans. So it is consistent every time you read a prophet, you find there is a very dominant government of the time. But then we find these earlier also. However, we find these 2 days with the Samaritans indicating the renewed covenant. Up to the point of the Messiah, then Yahweh was in charge of the world. Then the authority was given to the Son in heaven and on the earth. So then the Son had then his understanding copied from his Father, obviously, because both of them must point to the instructions. So then you find a prophet, a great king, a prophet, a great king, prophet, a great king, and at the end would be then the prophecies in the last kingdom that would then lead on until the end. So then we are harmoniously in line with the scripture from the original manuscripts. It's very important mentioning. So then the war in Syria, now we have the Lebanon also trying to oust the government. But then if we are smart, we make a deal with China. We give them more space and waters around China so they can resolve their skirmishes. But then we make those countries then report to the UN for talks, because the world wants to know what goes on. As then the Chinese begins then their going out of their military, their navy, from their countries, they begin to be more prominent in international waters. Then given this first opening of the Chinese going out, then we understand then they should break their relationship with Syria. Then Syria is cornered. So rather than the Chinese going from the back gate and trying to be there with them and fueling this junky war, then we can give them some space up front, as long as they report to the UN, and then enforce their peace via trade. Because their computerized system requires a peaceful and harmonious system to get their trade going around the world, as we understand. From the 8th chapter, 3rd part of the ships, speaks of China, then Shaliach Shaul teaching in Asia, leadership of the world. So we begin to link those areas, then we are in solid ground. So then tiny adjustments must be made on our part, because then as the Chinese, they go out and begin to expand, then we begin to watch the times and the seasons when we should retrieve, how we should retrieve, because the Chinese, they have the solely understanding of maintaining peace for trade. They are not going to invade any other country, because the countries are then linked with the UN. They have to come regularly for talks. This is what we should enforce. As long as we then promote the Chinese emancipation from their country, then we are in line with the scripture. And then we make the proper adjustments to make sure they take on the patrols, because those are very expensive. And then obviously, most importantly, while then the Chinese are taking over the areas of patrol for the solely purpose of trade, then we from behind, we make a deal with Congo. Then it's going to be the first strong relationship with our country in Africa, as then both places begin to rebuild together. Because then rare metal is going to be extremely vital for us as we then embark ourselves in trying to get our economy moving up in terms of the high technological equipment and new technologies. We have to have coltan and some other rare materials, and then we begin to make a relationship with Congo, and then we begin to improve our economy. Because we understand we can't fight against cheap manufacturing of China. However, manufacturing related with new technologies, then we can make sure we have those in our own country. So the plan is working perfectly. But then it has to have a person of knowing what not to do. Because the plan is delicately put together for a reason, and then as we are smart and wise, we begin to act on time. In other words, rather than having sanctions upon countries, then we work with China. As China releases itself from those countries, then they have to stop the war. And then it helps us and it helps them. Because rather than the Chinese going from the back door, then they go front gate. And then we begin to do our own work, because our idea is then retrieving ourselves from expensive patrols. Indicating to the world we have the best intentions for them to do trade, because we know the computerized system is coming. And quite honestly, the Chinese only is waiting for us then to go out in the world, they spend what we don't have, and then crash our economy. That's what they're waiting for. They know if we try to make a push at this time, we're going to ruin ourselves. They know it. And they are very smart also, because they know the Eurozone is going to break. That's when the time when the system then is down in Europe, then the system also is down in America, and then the Middle East is at war. That's when they're going to launch the important computerized system. But we don't want to ruin our economy, do we, or our country? We act prior of very smartly, because we have from Yahweh His holy plan. So please stay tuned, much more coming up, because later in Revelation there are a whole lot more many topics related with our time, and most importantly learn the times and seasons, because we are truly during the time of restoration. Please stay tuned.